Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Mark Plant. I'm a Senior Policy Fellow at the Center for Global Development and the Co-Director of our Sustainable Development Finance Program. On behalf of all my colleagues at CGD, I would like to welcome you to this discussion of fiscal policies to address climate change in Asia and the Pacific. As we emerge from the COVID crisis, the world's leaders are focused on putting in place the policies and financing to promote a green and equitable recovery. While many are focused on the investment necessary to give us a sustainable future, it will be an uphill battle if we do not have the supportive macroeconomic policies underlying a recalibration of economic activity. Fiscal policies have been used with great effect in the developed world, particularly to dampen the effects of the COVID crisis. As we emerge from the crisis, fiscal policies will have to be changed to give governments the room they need to invest in their people and to provide the incentives for the private sector to invest in green infrastructure. And the Asia and Pacific region will be critical in this regard. It is home to a large portion of the world's population with a diverse range of countries, some low-income countries, rapidly growing emerging markets, dynamic middle-income countries, and highly developed economies facing challenges of aging populations and sluggish growth. I think it's fair to say that if Asia does not get this transition right, then the world will not get it right. And the challenges that Asia faces are those that the world faces. So I'm very pleased to welcome my friends and colleagues from the IMF to CGD today to present their comprehensive study on fiscal policies to address climate change in Asia and Pacific. It's great to see yet another high quality and provocative study from the IMF on how to transit to a green and equitable future. Let me introduce our speakers and give you the run of show. First, we'll have a presentation of the IMF study by James Daniels, who's Assistant Director in the IMF's Fiscal Affairs Department. We'll then hear the thoughts of three distinguished economists who have deep knowledge of both climate issues and the Asia-Pacific region. First, Alicia Garcia-Herrero, who's a senior fellow at Bruegel and Chief Economist for Asia-Pacific at Nexus, and holds a variety of senior advisory positions for financial institutions in Asia. Sunny Kapoor is the Managing Director of the Nordic Institute for Finance, Technology and Sustainability, and also the Managing Director of Redefine. And Swatha Saxena is the Chief of Macroeconomic Policy and Financing for Development at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. After the panelists' interventions, we'll take questions from the audience. You can send us questions in three ways. First, on Twitter by using @CGDev or hashtag CGDevTalks, by email, events@cgdev.org, and using the question function in YouTube. So with those introductory remarks, let me now turn to James to present the IMF report. James, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you for inviting me to this event. And it's a pleasure to be here. I'll now try and share my slides with everybody. Does that work? People seeing slides? Great. Excellent. Well, thanks again. Good morning, afternoon, evening, delete as appropriate. It's great to be here. And it's also great to be talking about climate right now because momentum is growing, I think it's clear to say, with the US rejoining the Paris Agreement and together with quite a few other countries putting forward more ambitious commitments ahead of COP26 in Glasgow in November. I'd like to present to you some work we've done here at the IMF about the fiscal policies that are needed to address climate change in Asia and the Pacific. Let me go to my first slide. So this slide, as Mark said in his introductory remarks, it's all about, if Asia gets this transition right, the world will probably get it right, and vice versa. So the point here is that Asia is really the crux of mankind's fight against climate change. As you can see from this graph, Asia emits about half of global greenhouse gases, and is growing fast. And on the other side, it's also the region that is likely to suffer the most from climate change. Now, it's not the IMF's place to say which countries should cut emissions and by how much. That's not our business. What we can say is that if China and India and just a handful of globally systemic emitters don't make a much bigger effort, the world as a whole will fail to keep the Paris Agreement's target of 1.5 to 2 degrees warming. Okay, next slide. So in Asia, just like all the other countries that have signed up to the Paris Agreement, every country has made a pledge under the Paris Agreement to cut their emissions. Now, these pledges are currently being updated ahead of COP26, and this study uses the one from 2015, but they'll still be quite illustrative, I think, of the challenges and the policies that face this region. Now, we're at the IMF, and I think the economics profession in generally is quite clear that the most efficient way to achieve these emissions cuts is by putting a price on carbon. Two ways of doing that, really: carbon tax or a trading system. Now, if we look at Asia's Paris commitments as a region, we think only a modest carbon tax of about $25 per ton is required. Each country have their own targets, and they vary a lot in ambition and initial circumstances. And so the carbon tax required for each, the carbon price required for each varies, and it varies quite a lot, as you can see. Some countries like the Philippines would require quite high carbon taxes to achieve their pledges, but others like India require almost zero. However, carbon taxes and carbon pricing are very little used in Asia. And the other point I'd like to make is, even if Asia, and indeed the world, were to achieve their Paris commitments, that's still far from enough for the world to keep global warming in a safe range. So we have to go way beyond the existing Paris pledges. Let me move on to the next slide. Now, of course, is the hard part. The other side to a carbon tax is higher prices for carbon, and that's how they work. Now, of course, for energy will go up, carbon-based energy prices will go up, but by differing amounts depending on the carbon intensity of the energy. For Asia as a whole, natural gas and electricity would go up about 50% if the carbon tax were to be $75. Sorry, just to say, $75 we think should be the global price of carbon to achieve the Paris commitments. So if Asia were to apply a $75 carbon tax, that's a 50% increase in natural gas and electricity prices, which is pretty substantial. However, for coal, the price increase would be even larger, as it is the most polluting form of fossil fuel. Even, as you can see here, a $25 tax would almost double the price of coal. So, of course, this would affect some households, some firms, some workers. The good news, though, is that they can be identified and they can be compensated. And in fact, it could even produce an overall positive effect on equality. Let's take China, for example. Now, the idea behind this rather busy graph is that there's a bunch of policies they already have, a bunch of welfare schemes that are already in existence that could be increased using the revenue from a carbon tax. So on the far left of the graph, you can see China's Gini is quite high, 0.48, that's pretty high. And then we run the experiment. Let's say you impose a carbon tax, 25, whatever, and you recycle that money into one of these existing policies, programs that you see at the bottom. So let's take the old age pension. Let's say you would take the money from the carbon tax and then put it all into the old age pension, just increased by the amount of money you've raised. And you'll see that the overall Gini in China would drop to 0.45. So pretty much any of these policies would, if you recycle the money, would improve equality in China, which is an objective of the government. It would also help boost consumption and rebalance the economy away from investment. Now, Of course, a carbon tax, as economists realize, may be the most efficient way, but it's not necessarily the best way for each country. Each country will have to work its own way through all the various options and the politics. And also for countries with a high degree of state involvement, for instance, China, regulations and top-down guidance will also need to play an important role. And of course, green investment, incentives for research and development will also have to play a role. What matters is the result. And of course, advanced countries need to meet or ideally increase their commitments to provide 100 billion in annual climate financing to developing countries. Now, let's turn to the other side of the coin, the exposure of Asia to climate change. Now, this graph tries to illustrate the countries that are exposed and the countries that can adapt. Now, the higher up you are in this graph, the more adaptive capacity you have. Your institutions, your finances, the more you're able to adapt to a changing climate. And you can see all the countries in purple are at the top, and those are the advanced countries, the Australias and New Zealands, etc. So they have the highest adaptive capacity. And then as you go down the graph into the middle, you see all these scattered orange emerging market economies. And then as you go down to the green dots, those are the low-income economies in Asia, and they have the weakest adaptive capacity. As you go to the right of the graph, you're more exposed to climate change. So the place you don't want to be is in the bottom right. And who are the countries there? Well, it's the poorest and the smallest. It's the Solomon Islands and Bangladesh. It's Papua New Guinea. It's Vanuatu. So the most exposed are often those that are least able to, least lowest capacity to adapt. On that theme, let's move to the next slide. The countries, as I was saying, with the weakest capacity to adapt and the most exposed also have the lowest fiscal space to respond, for example, by building resilient infrastructure. I went to Tonga recently, actually not recently, in pre-COVID times, and we looked in detail at their climate resilient infrastructure plans. And to achieve them would probably require spending of about 14% of GDP per year for the next 10 years. But Tonga, like many vulnerable countries, doesn't have the fiscal space. In this graphic here, we split up the countries according to the IMF's assessment of their fiscal space with how much we think they'll need to spend on adaptation over the next few years. And again, the place you don't want to be is in the right square. That's the countries that have least fiscal space, least ability to spend, and the highest fiscal needs. And those are countries like Kiribati and Laos and Tonga, as I was saying. Okay, so I think that gets me to my final slide. And I think I'm within my 10 minutes, but let me just summarize. So to summarize, what are the implications for Asian policymakers in our view? First of all, there's a huge need to increase mitigation ambition, to do more to cut emissions. And we think there should be a large role for carbon pricing, but there are, of course, many options. Secondly, we fully recognize there will be many losers from this, but we suggest that these firms, these workers can be identified. And there already exists in the large number of these countries schemes that already exist that can be scaled up to compensate. And then there's a big need for those countries. I mean, a lot of climate change is already baked in for the next 10 or 20 years, and it will get worse. And many countries haven't even adjusted to their own climate yet. So there's a big need to build more resilient infrastructure and to prepare for climate change. And unfortunately, the countries that are most exposed don't have the fiscal space, which brings me to the last point, that we think there's a lot of merit in increasing multilateral financing for climate change. I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Let me stop sharing my slide, if I may, if I can manage that.
Thank you, James. It was a very clear presentation of what's in fact a very in-depth, complicated report. So appreciate your clarity. Let's turn to our speakers now. I'd like to remind them that they each have 10 minutes. I'll give you gentle warning after about 8 minutes and a sterner warning after 10. Alicia, what did you take away from the IMS report? You're still on mute, Alicia.
Yes, and I'm muting myself. It's taking some time. Can you hear me? Yes, so you can hear me, which is already quite something. Second thing I'm trying to do is to upload my presentation.
We can do it from here if you'd like.
Yes, a sec. It's just so many things here. Somehow I can't.
Let us see if we can run it for you.
Yes, please, so that we don't waste time. Thank you for that.
I think it's going up now. There it is.
Yes.
Presentation mode and go. There we go. And just tell how when you need the screen.
Okay, so I like to start by saying that having worked for the fund ages ago, I have to say that I'm so pleased to see a piece of work like the one we have just been happy to hear about and to read, because it's really a core issue that might not have been, in the good old times, something that the fund might have done. And I think that's the first thing I want to say, that it's great to see the fund involved in such an important issue. And in the area of competence of the fund, meaning fiscal and monetary policy, and all of the more macro issues, because this is not just a micro exercise. This is not about having, a good functioning ETS, or it's much more than that. How do we actually make it happen at the macro level? This is what the paper wants to do. So my comments are going to really reflect that. And I would start by saying that while the paper focuses very much on carbon pricing, rightly so, Asia is so far from anything similar to what, by the way, Europe, and still very far from what is needed, has already done. This is the first slide of my presentation. And I don't know if the slides can be, So basically, you see there are very few countries. This comes from your report, Singapore and Japan, and they are like ages from, major European countries. So the first thing to say is, why are we here? Is this because the proposed major measure, which is, again, carbon pricing, is not the way Asia is going, or is it simply because there's no other way Asia is going yet? If it's the latter, I think we really need to speed up. If it's the former, i.e. Asia is thinking differently about this, it would be nice to see how. And I didn't catch that very clearly in the report. So that's one. So is there an Asian way, in other words, and especially as regards fiscal policy? Yeah. Is it about, I don't know, eliminating subsidies? Is it about, other ways to, is it about forcefully imposing reductions in the use of, say, coal? Obviously in China, we've seen a lot lately, especially after the White House summit. I mean, big changes in objectives and the amount of coal used for production. So I think, and transportation. So I think this is something that we may think about. Is there a different way, at least for some Asian countries? The next slide is a little bit the same story. I mean, again, from your report, will there be anything like a market in Asia? I mean, you have here some examples or ETFs and so on, but it doesn't look really, of the size that we would obviously have in Europe. So then I move a little bit more about my own recommendations or ideas for sharing in the next slide. And this is really about what to do, in the sense that, so if Asia being the largest emitter, as you just pointed out, and I'm not judging whether this is right or wrong, because you have a different graph in the report showing emitters by level of development and how that would change, So avoiding any type of judgment, the whole point here is that being the largest emitter, the mitigation mechanisms should be even larger than, in other parts of the world, especially in Europe, which is what I'm focusing on. So So how to do that? And most importantly, being the largest emitter, the problem of carbon leakage, and this is a very European topic, becomes very important for the rest of the world. So there's two things here, I think, that need to come together. One, is this really an Asian problem, or is it a global problem? And maybe if it is a global problem, any design of carbon pricing that is only local, domestic, might not be enough, given the size of the problem in relative terms as well. So moving to the next slide, at Bruegel, we've worked, especially, of course, on the European side of things, as to how to actually achieve a whole economy carbon price, because that's the other thing. I mean, in Europe, we do have carbon pricing and carbon taxes, but the point is they tax very different things. So, like type of pollutants that are taxed in Norway. I was just reading a report before the meeting, is like 60% of total, while in Spain is only 3%, say. So it's obviously not homogeneous even in Europe. And at Bruegel, we've been working on that idea of basically making that carbon pricing more homogeneous across sectors. So, for example, how to get together the transportation sector to what we have now. And I think that's one thing that Asia has to think about. I mean, how to really have one carbon price, first per country, and then I will move swiftly for the benefit of time to the next slide, which is, again, so, ways to get to that one carbon price, and getting transportation and heating closer to the industrial, then some idea of carbon price balancer to manage price differences to get to that convergence. I realize that this is far for Asia because we are still in a very embryonic stage, but I think it's better to map where you want to head before just introducing carbon taxes. And then I think very importantly is the idea of fostering innovation to make all of this less costly. So some kind of complementary policies, whether it's carbon price amplifiers, which literally mean that there is a huge incentive to innovate, to reduce the use of carbon, and thus make this carbon pricing also less costly, because more naturally you will be reducing emissions and the use of fossil fuels. The very, very tricky issue of what we call the Green Deal in Europe, or basically cross-border carbon adjustment tax. I think this is essential as a topic for the paper, and more generally for fiscal policy in Asia, because at the end of the day, Asia, all in all, especially China, but other economies, Taiwan is another case of big worries about the potential impact of this tax on their exports. So how to strike a balance here? Because I do think we need some kind of cross-border mechanism, but how to reach one that is palatable for everybody, and what's the role of fiscal policy, even I would argue more internationally, or more, in a cooperative way to do that. And finally, we didn't talk about the idea of green financing for the sovereign debt, which is one aspect we could argue could be important on the fiscal front. Subsidization, even public procurement. I mean, the design of public procurement that does take into account climate change targets. So that's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alicia. I think you raise a question: is there an Asian way that might be different than the global way? And even if they follow the global way, how are they going to implement it within the Asian context? Let me turn next to Sunny for his reflections on the report. Sunny, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, I think exactly as was said, the future of climate change is going to be decided in Asia. And I'm quite optimistic about it. And here are my reasons. The first is, I mean, given the size of Asia and given also exactly as the fund report points out, it is the region most vulnerable, particularly for the larger economies, India and China. They are seeing in real time, the impacts, the human cost, the economic cost of climate change. So in some sense, the idea of externalities applies far less in Asia because large part of the externalities coming from the advantages flowing to other countries of climate mitigation actually fall within these countries. And given the very severe expected to get much worse climate impacts in the physical sense over the next decade or so, the incentive to act is going to be far, far stronger than in most other parts of the world, especially in the developed world. So that's something that's acting in our favor from a policy action point of view. The second, I think, is important, particularly post-COVID, is the export-led manufacturing growth model, the infrastructure intensive growth model. The timing of that sort of might have run out, right? So it's absolutely obvious to me that India will never become the infrastructure giant that China is. That is infeasible. Now, that actually is very good from a climate perspective. If the focus of the Indian developmental model is far more service oriented, and particularly post-COVID, because what COVID has done is COVID has pushed the boundary of services from OECD economies that can be outsourced and delivered remotely, including the kind of high value services that all of us on this panel are performing, right? I mean, we've done a reasonably good job in the past year working remotely, and we are all in the top 1% of the best paid people in the world, or somewhere thereabouts, right? So the potential developmental model that countries, particularly in South Asia, can follow, for example, will be a different one, which means that the baseline carbon intensity of emissions is likely to be different from the one that has been projected in the past using past growth models. So that's, again, something that's very, very favorable. The third is, I mean, and that's a tragedy, but also an opportunity, which is while we're talking about, positive carbon prices of $25 to $75, the reality is that in effect, across most of Asia, carbon price is negative at present, right? I mean, subsidies, consumption subsidies, for instance, are so large in many countries that the real effective carbon price is negative. So even before we go to implementing positive carbon prices, the removal of subsidies is already very, very substantial. And, so in terms of the policy impulse that is delivered, the removal of, let's say, $50 of carbon subsidy is equivalent to the imposition of a carbon price of 50 if you have no subsidy. So that, again, is something that's, in a way, in terms of the starting point where Asia is and what can happen over the next decade, is advantageous. And it has proven to be politically difficult, but Indonesia and India have successfully moved in the right direction, and I think the potential there is huge and significant. The fourth point, I think, is that Asia across different countries has a relatively fairly sound institutional structure of national development banks, regional development banks, including the AIIB and then now the NDB. And these are, they fall in the realm of what one would call near fiscal policy, right? I mean, most of them are fiscally backed, fiscally dependent, and even implementing policies here of saying no to coal financing or shadow carbon prices, which has been quite popular within the financial sector, where at the time of project financing, you assume a future carbon price, which could be a round number of 25 or 50, to calculate whether the project meets viability thresholds or not. And so it's politically less hard to do. It's less in your face. It's less likely to mobilize constituencies against. But in terms of real impact, cost of financing, which projects go ahead and not, which ones are viable or not, that has a very real impact. The fifth point, I think, and again, this is sort of near fiscal policy, is that if you assume two different pathways, let's say 1 gigawatt of fossil fuel power versus 1 gigawatt of renewable, the cost structures are very different, right? I mean, for fossil fuel power, the upfront project cost is small. The majority of the costs fall in the next 10 to 20 years coming from fuel. And for renewables, it's exactly the opposite, which means that were Asia to go down the path of significant mitigation over the next decade, the upfront capital costs will be much, much higher, right? So the capital shortage that is required for governments to be able to, and the need for the private sector to be involved in the financing of the transition is going to be huge. And this, of course, links to the point that Alicia was making, that this means significantly larger borrowing. This means the opportunity for financial market actors. And given that, we in Europe have a huge imbalance of sort of excess savings, and it's going to be partly our savings, that can absolutely nudge governments through green bonds and other channels in a direction that is sort of far more sustainable. And that requires the sixth point is, and this is a completely underdeveloped area in Asia, which is the region as a whole has countries that have sort of significant shortage of savings compared to the investment needs, and that includes large parts of South Asia, for example. And then you have countries in East Asia, you have China, you have Japan, countries with huge excess savings. And as of now, the regional intermediation of Asian savings for financing Asian investments is very limited. Far too much of it flows into the financial sector in London, in New York, becomes dollarized and is sent back. And I think there's a huge potential efficiency advantage, reducing currency risk, as well as coordinating policy advantage if one were to get more successful at intermediating Asian savings within Asia. And indirectly, again, linking back to the Asian Investment Bank and the Belt and Roads Initiative, et cetera, right? I mean, depending on how green those investments, which are sort of near fiscal, because there's a implicit government guarantee involved, is going to have a significant impact on the path followed. And the other important thing in terms of potential regional coordination is the significant adoption of the RCEP and other, ASEAN is already a fairly strongly integrated bloc. So there are these regional trade pacts, et cetera, that offer sensible mechanisms for coordination, particularly in the face of, it doesn't have to be real, the border adjustment tax, but at least as long as there is a possibility of a border adjustment tax being levied, there can be preemptive policies adopted within Asia to be far more climate friendly. And I think, those are my sort of main points.
Thank you, Sunny. It's nice to hear an optimistic take, and really the notion that Asia has the incentive to do it for itself, and that will have benefits for the entire world. And Asia has the capacity, if it would exploit it, within its own grand borders to solve the problem. Swatha, let me turn to you next.
Thank you, Mark. Just let me put my slides up. Here we go. Okay. Can you see? Okay, good. Good, actually. Thanks, Mark, for the opportunity to comment on this really nice topic first of all. And the curse of being the last presenter means that whatever I was supposed to actually say, much of it has already been said. Having said that, I'm still going to go over all the slides I have, partly because I've prepared them and partly just to emphasize the importance of all these things. And along the way, what I'm also going to highlight is some of the work that we have been doing at UNSCAP for the last 3 years related to the topic we are discussing today. So let me go over my overall comments is like, well, the region is facing a big climate crisis is partly because there has been overemphasis of economic growth without much attention being paid to social and environmental issues over the last couple of decades. It has been definitely a growth engine for the entire world. We all know that. And unlike other organizations, we at the UN, at least, we think of sustainable development in a more holistic manner. So rather than in a peaceful fashion. So climate change for us, when we look at it, It's a part of the bigger issue within the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Likewise, to deal with climate change, fiscal policy, we believe, is one of the tools, but it's not the only game in town. We need a bigger contribution from other stakeholders as well. And I think one of the questions actually Mark had posed earlier was about the transitioning to low carbon. It's hard to sell politically, definitely. It's hard to sell politically, especially in a region that, first of all, it's a very diverse region, at least the one that I cover at UNSCAP. It starts all the way from Turkey to Kiribati, from Russia all the way down to New Zealand. For a region that feels that it was not responsible for the climate change problem, but it actually has been at the receiving end because of the frequency of natural disasters, climate-related disasters that it has been facing. So it's really hard. And of course, one of the things, I think somebody probably made that point, benefits of tackling climate change are shared broadly, basically. However, costs are very local. So it's very hard to sell it politically also and justify to your electorate why you want to actually deal with climate change. And countries in the region, including China, Japan, and Korea, have recently announced great plans to tackle climate change and reach net zero by 2050 or 2060. However, more concrete actions we are still waiting to see. Having said that, though, let me actually go back and emphasize one of the things that in order to deal with two major problems facing the global economy right now, both inequality and climate change, they can only be tackled through a more comprehensive, holistic plan. And for us at the United Nations, Sustainable Development Goals give us that blueprint. And as you can see, climate change is a part of that bigger plan. It's global. Climate change particularly is goal 13. However, it's not just 1 out of 17, like, it carries the weight of 1 out of 17th, 17%, 1 out of 17% basically of all those goals. Climate change is related to many, it has spillover effects on so many of the other goals, whether it's related to poverty, health, decent work, biodiversity, and progress on climate change actually depends on one of the other critical goals, which is goal 7, affordable and clean energy. That means decarbonizing our energy systems becomes even more important. And also, if you note from this, climate change, goal 13 is one of the goals that is actually, that's where Asia Pacific is regressing rather than progressing towards achieving it by 2030. So 2 years ago, actually, in our flagship, we wanted to understand what does it take Asia Pacific to achieve the 2030 agenda by 2030. So we had separated these 17 goals into people, prosperity, and planet, which means that, and we calculated what are the additional investments needed. Okay, so whatever they were doing on top of that. It was the additional investments are about $1.5 trillion per year, which is just about 5% of GDP of the developing Asia Pacific. And for that, we needed about $670 billion to invest in people, which means ending poverty and hunger and providing universal healthcare and education. It also meant that we needed to invest an additional $590 billion for the planet, which means securing humanity's future and living in harmony with nature. Now, what does that mean? It means actions on climate mitigation, which means renewable energy and energy efficiency, climate adaptation, resilient infrastructure, climate resilient infrastructure, and environmental conservation. And on top of that, we need about $196 billion to provide sustainable infrastructure, which means roads and railways, ITC, and water and sanitation. Now, we've calculated it, and I think different countries have their own estimates, actually. We know how much would it cost to fight this climate change, and we also know the benefits, so why is it not happening? In our report last year, we had covered this, that there are reasons different stakeholders actually have their own interest, which keeps the status quo going. So for instance, governments depend on revenues from fossil fuels, which actually has led to underpricing of carbon and of course, overconsumption. And each ministry, another reason why we never actually have more action on climate change, because each ministry works in silos, ignoring the interdependencies and hence without a holistic approach towards solving climate change. Then coming to another sector, another stakeholder, which is the businesses, they are continuously actually maximizing their profits for shareholders, ignoring externalities of their business activities on other stakeholders. And lastly, consumers, they may actually have some ingrained consumption habits and not be aware of environmental impact of their consumption behavior. So as you can see that everybody has their own incentive to actually continue to work the way they do. And that's why we have status quo. Now, in this year's report that we just launched on March 30th, we actually highlighted how to build resilience. And for that, we looked at the landscape of risk that the Asia Pacific region faces. And you can see that Asia Pacific faces a lot of risk like any other region, basically, whether it's economic or non-economic. But climate-related disasters were already very prominent in the region, and they're likely going to become even more so in the future. And in our flagship, we also show that how economic shocks tend to have both social and environmental impacts. Similarly, non-economic shocks, think about a pandemic. It's a non-economic shock, but has huge economic costs. So that's why it is actually in the interest of all governments to think of, like, in a more holistic manner. And we emphasize in our reports about risk management should become part and parcel of development policy making and planning. So just to give you an example, these shocks are very important because they leave permanent scars along all dimensions. Here you can see a natural disaster. It not only lowers investment and human capital and even environmental damage, basically, in the very first year of when it takes place, but even 5 years later, you tend to see the damage. So it's a long-term scar that it leaves. And of course, you also should remember that the impact tends to be more severe and persistent in countries which had underinvested in people and planet. So which are a lot of our countries from the region. So now I just want to emphasize that, COVID, I think I'm an optimist by nature. So I think COVID has given us the opportunity for a reset where we can agree on a common social contract, where we can bring economic, social, and environmental justice to all. So in this year's report we just launched, actually, we have proposed a package that consists of 3 sub-packages. A social services package that enhances access to health and social protection floor. Digital access package, which means investments in ICT and more spending on education. And lastly, a green development package, which means investing in energy access and efficiency, climate resilient infrastructure, and biodiversity preservation. It also includes eliminating fossil fuel subsidies and introducing a carbon tax, something you just heard actually in presentations before. So in this, we analyze 2 different spending levels. One is the ambitious level, which is basically how much would it cost to achieve the 2030 agenda, which is something I showed earlier, the cost, which we estimated 2 years ago. And also business as usual sort of spending level, which means it's certain proportion of your ambitious spending level depending on the resources you've been receiving in the past. So on average, business as usual spending levels are about 40% of the ambitious level. So if you take all these 3 packages together and you make an investment in that, you see huge economic benefits, which I'm not even showing you right now, in terms of potential output and employment and all those kind of things. But it actually brings a lot of social and environmental benefits. You can see the number of poor can go down by about 180 million in the long run. You can see inequality coming down significantly, carbon emissions coming down 30% in the long run, and even the air quality improving. Now, if you do business as usual spending levels, well, they are actually positive, but not as large as in the ambitious level. So just to give you a sense that number of poor people who will be pulled out of poverty will be 55 million instead of 180 million. But nonetheless, there'll be significant benefits still if you invest in this package. Now, we've been talking a little bit about the fiscal space and fiscal resources and everything. Of course, if you want to spend all that money on these 3 different packages we are proposing, it is going to put pressure on public debt, because most of the financing is actually coming from the government. It's spending not just to actually 8 minutes, 10 minutes already. I'll finish in another 2 minutes. How's that?
That's fine.
Okay. Okay. So just to give you a sense, actually, they spend in majority of the, like on average in developing countries, debt is supposed to go up from about 50% in 2019 to about 75% in 2030. However, it's going to go up by even more for least developed countries. So it's going to more than double from about 35% to 90%. Now, in our flagship report, we have a lot of financing options. I'm not listing all of them, but just to mention, actually, we actually talk about how they can be dealt with through debt swaps for development or climate change or whatever climate swaps that can be done, and also possible use of diaspora bonds or offshore bonds, especially for countries that do not tend to have their own bond markets. We also recommend countries to consider incorporating catastrophic risk and fiscal planning. And lastly, with $7.6 trillion of assets sitting idle in pension funds and sovereign wealth funds, we encourage countries to relax investment rules and financial regulators to agree on common ESG principles and practices to support sustainable investing by public institutional investors. And by the way, this entire scenario just had no other tax imposition except a carbon tax, which was also at a modest level of $40 per ton. But a lot of these countries tend to have very low revenue collections anyway, so there's a lot of room for improving tax collections anyways. Lastly, this is my last slide, Mark, I'm coming actually. So lastly, just to say that climate change requires a shift in mindset and action by all, not just the government. Yes, governments can certainly eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. They can have more comprehensive integrated planning, and they can green the financial system by enforcing environmental related disclosures and reporting, among other things. Businesses also can internalize the impact of their business operations by incorporating ESG considerations into their business decision-making, enhancing climate-related disclosures, financial disclosures, and also adopting internal carbon pricing. And lastly, as consumers, we need to be a little bit more mindful of our own consumption behaviors also, whereby we should choose sustainable lifestyles. I'll end here. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mark. Back to you.
Thank you, Swatha. It's very good to remind us that climate is part of a complex of problems that the world is trying to look after, an important part, but it has to be a holistic package if we're really to make progress on any piece of it. All right, so we're going to open up the floor to questions from the audience. We have a few already, but I want to remind you how you can pose those questions. On Twitter, you can use @CGDev or hashtag CGDTalks. By email, you can send an email to events@cgdev.org, or you can use the question function on YouTube. Before we turn to the audience questions, let me give the floor to James. You want to react to some of the presenters' comments on your report.
Well, thank you very much. And there's a lot of alignment here, and all the commentators are very expert in these issues. I just want to pick up on a couple of things. On Alicia's question about the Asian way, yes, there may well be. We're looking forward to seeing it, but I think a carbon price will have to play a large role if we're going to avoid huge inefficiencies. The point about the carbon price is that it directs the market and directs the millions and millions of people involved. There's an interesting issue that Alicia raised and Sonny too, and one that I ducked really because it's very controversial, but maybe it's worth putting out there, is the border carbon adjustment. Now, as we know, Europe is promising to do it. The US, I'm not quite sure what the position is there, but it is conceivable there, I guess. Canada there could be implications there. So I think border carbon adjustments are being considered. And this has to be seen in the multilateral context. We at the IMF have called for a multilateral global carbon price floor amongst the major emitters. It doesn't have to be the same price across India and the US, but if the big five would agree this is our price, and everybody else who wants to sell to our markets needs to have pretty much the same, or else they pay a border carbon adjustment, that it could incentivize an awful lot of, I think it was Sonny who said preemptive policy, and that would be a very positive outcome. And I think Asia should keep their eye on what's happening in Europe and elsewhere. Then on Sonny's comments, so nice to hear the positivity. I might even add a positive one myself. When I was working on China, when I started, the price of solar was very expensive. By the time I finished, it was very, very low. Maybe, China, when it gets behind something, can really move, the entire global economy and change the industrial pricing of all this stuff. And on Swatha, yes, we're very much on the same page. And I think that isn't understood enough, just how cross-cutting climate is. There's a tendency, And I'm fairly new to this business that I thought, when I first came across this issue 5-10 years ago, oh, this is an environmental ministry issue. The point is now, this is a Ministry of Finance issue. It's not just, you can't just hive it off to the Ministry of Economy and let them deal with it. No, it's cuts across everything in your budget now. You can't just separate it out. And like resilience investment, everything, even when I was in Tonga, they had no schools. They're being taught in camps because the schools have been blown away by the recent typhoon. So even education spending, you can say, well, the schools need to be made resilient. So you can't have a separate budget line for climate and think you're done. That's it. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, James. So we have a few questions here, and I encourage people to continue to pose questions. One pose for you, James. I'll give you the floor again. To what extent has the IMF's fiscal policy analysis on climate change, and particularly the recommendations for policy action, been incorporated in the IMF's work with countries, particularly in their surveillance work, or what we IMF insiders know as Article 4 consultations? And when these discussions are had, does it change government priorities? Can you see any change, or what's the resistance, and what do they push back about?
That's a very good question. For those of us who don't, for those who may not know the fund so well, every year we do an annual checkup, like going to the doctor. We give you an annual health check, and we do this for pretty much every country. We write an annual report. I think the answer is, to what extent are we including climate issues? The answer is much more than we used to, but by no means comprehensively. What we've seen so far in the IMF is we started off picking and choosing a few of the big emitters to talk about carbon pricing. And increasingly, this we have been doing for longer, natural disaster work. That has moved and broadened now into climate resilience in general. So you're seeing these in the Granadas and the Tongas, and even last year's Sub-Saharan African Regional Outlook had a big section on adaptation. So the answer is, we've got the message. This is now, as the commentators have said, this is a macro critical issue, and that's the way we're approaching it. Now, we may not have it for Belgium, but we probably will have it for Bangladesh. So we're being a bit selective as well. So that's the broad answer. What's the resistance, and what are the changes? I wouldn't want to say that we've changed policy. Maybe we brought awareness of options and the ins and outs of some of these issues to some policymakers. I think we've also managed to show the world that the integration of climate and finance, and that if you want to deal with climate, it has to be a Ministry of Finance issue and it needs to be financed. So I think that's our role, as the macro financial implications. And I think the response we get from countries is on carbon pricing, it's the politics. I think most countries are pretty convinced, on an economic basis, it makes a lot of sense. But as the European head of the Eurogroup once said, we know the right policy, we just don't know how to be re-elected once we've done it. I think the social acceptance of it is the main problem. And on the resistance side, they say, yes, we agree, it'd be great if we can invest in all these really high quality climate resistance infrastructure, but we don't have the money. And that's where the conversation tends to stop.
Thanks. Alicia, you argued for a common or unique carbon price as much as possible across Asia. And one of our members of our audience says, how can you achieve that when the countries in the region are so profoundly diverse in their economic, political, and power structures? I mean, does it make real sense to have the same carbon price in a developing country as in a very developed country?
Yes, it doesn't. And that was my point, and I'm sorry I wasn't clear. I meant to say that you have to obtain a single carbon price within a country, which is very hard even in Europe. We're not there yet. And for the cross-border issues, I do think that the world, not only Europe, has to think of a cross-border carbon adjustment price. It's the one and only way to avoid carbon leakage. So these are two separate things indeed.
And can we expect China and India really to agree with the EU and the United States on a common carbon price? I mean, that's what we're going to need, it sounds like, eventually. Are we going to get there? This is for anybody. Well, Alicia, you can start.
Well, I guess it it is even worse if you are a large exporter. So I think China is probably, the hardest one to bring towards this idea, because at the end of the day, by exporting goods, you are exporting carbon, and you're also, the European idea is not so much necessarily taxing every export, but it's taxing the European companies that offshore their production to avoid carbon taxes in Europe. Or so that's basically the idea. But of course, if you push the argument, you could argue that you could also tax products that are sold in your market but are produced using fossil fuels. So I would argue that on both accounts, China is by far the most hit, more than India, because of the largest share of foreign FDI in manufacturing and of course the export driven economy. So how to bring China to I really don't know. Maybe we need to I wouldn't say subsidize, but maybe we need to think of a way that is not necessarily only costly for China. I just can't think of a way to do it. But yes, it's a global problem. And as Swatha said, we were there before. Everybody needs to pay now. So that's the idea that, from this part of the world that is hard to swallow, which is understandable. So I guess it'll have to be a joint effort. How to share the costs is hard for me to tell. Yeah.
Swatha, you look like you want to come in. Go ahead.
Actually, I just wanted to add, basically, I don't know. There's a lot of emphasis on carbon pricing. I mean, yes, it can actually, the whole idea, at least I think of carbon pricing, is to discourage the use of carbon. The other way of you discouraging the use of carbon is by removing the carbon subsidies and actually stop funding the coal-fired plants. Who is funding all those, right? China, Japan, Korea. Now, recently they've been making statements they're not going to do that anymore. Actually, they don't do them in a lot of their own countries, but they're actually literally financing all the coal-fired plants actually around the region. So if they, first of all, removing subsidies from your own economies, we had the estimate in last year's report, the Asia Pacific region spends about $240 billion in subsidies. And it actually only it spends $50 billion actually in renewables. So think about it, removing it, first of all, it discourages people from using coal, and all that money can be used into actually renewables as well. So I don't understand why there's so much of emphasis on carbon tax rather than actually saying just remove the subsidies and stop funding coal-fired plants. Basically, that's one way of actually literally getting rid. But also last year's report, we actually spent a lot of time also arguing why it's in the interest of these nations, because all the coal plants and everything is in these countries are owned by government. And that's actually used in order to provide employment and generate revenues and stuff like that. So it's a little bit of the political economy too, but that's, I think that we can attack it by this one. One thing, James, you were mentioning at the beginning, no, US was very categorical. I don't know where their position is when this whole thing of cross-border came. I think John Kerry said that there is that cannot be on the table. So I think US is definitely not in favor of that cross-border tax. I just wanted to add that. Thanks.
Thanks, Swatha. So, Sonia, you look like you want to come in, and I have a question for you too, but why don't you respond to this conversation?
So four quick points. So one, politics, second, economics, third, finance, and four, what I call sort of shadow fiscal policy. So outside of China and Japan and Korea, most of the countries have a fairly young demographic profile, a significantly younger one, particularly in South Asia, compared to, Europe in particular. And believe it or not, but Greta's influence and the influence of Fridays for the Future is very, very real. The young folk, right? I mean, so from a political economy perspective, as more and more young people are getting engaged, having that younger demographic profile is very, very helpful for the direction of politics. And many of them are engaged. The second part is the urbanization, which again means the urbanization and the fact that, particularly out of Indonesia and Malaysia and the burning of the forest, and in India, the burning of the rice fields, etc. So it's not just, as I said, that Asia is a region, where a lot of the carbon externalities have an internal and often, immediate and visible impact. But all of the related pollutants, right, from sulfurous oxides to nitrous oxide, it's very, very real. The air is unbreathable. And the fact that this is often coming exactly from internal combustion engines and coal-fired plants, etc., is again, I mean, it's terrible from a humanity perspective, quality of life, but it's very, very good from the perspective of the delta of policy action, right? I mean, the motivation to act, the externalities are very visible. It's not that carbon dioxide is invisible, everything, it has all of these, and many, many lives will be saved. The third aspect, I think, is again, so I remember having written about the British Columbia revenue neutral carbon tax experiment, like, I don't know, 12 years back in 2009 or something. And now, and particularly post-COVID, right? Exactly as James was saying, I mean, you now have, even in relatively less developed countries, a fairly sophisticated, if not welfare net, a fairly sophisticated sort of infrastructure through mobile phones, payment networks, citizen registries, etc., that you can reach anybody, right? So in theory, a revenue neutral carbon tax can address many of the things that Swatha was saying, which is both redistributive and actually, being able to have the incentives that we were talking about. And of course, Swatha, you're very right. I mean, that's why, I had mentioned that in reality, the effective carbon price in many Asian countries is negative, right? I mean, so we do need to address that subsidy. And then last but not the least, and going back again to sort of, the project finance issue I raised, that we are now at a stage, and I'm glad James mentioned, solar, right? I mean, solar power is now at the stage where in many cases, it makes sense to mothball existing, completely depreciated solar power plant, coal-fired plants, and replace them with new solar, right? I mean, that is the level. And the pace of improvement of battery and solar, I mean, that is just breathtaking. And in some sense, right, I mean, the carbon price equivalent effect of that is likely to be not $25 or $50, but $100, $150. So again, we are talking about policies that are either directly fiscal or indirectly have exactly that same impact. And this technological move and changing politics and potential carbon adjustment tax exactly point all in the right direction.
Thanks, Sunny. Let me take off on that. It's a question someone posed to you. Was basically, they said this: you talked about trying to use the savings of the Western countries to move them to Asia. How can climate investment in Asia be incentivized, given the complex political, economic, and financial institutional constraints? What needs to be done to get that flow from Europe into Asia?
Well, I mean, so part of it is if you, and again, Asia is sort of everything. It's half the world, right? So many of the large Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds, the oil producers, oil exporters, and the largest oil exporters and the largest oil importers all lie in Asia. So but right now what happens is a lot of Asian savings, including from Japan, including, increasingly from China, and absolutely from the Middle East and North Africa, all get circulated into the Western financial system, where, through our systems, looking at FX risk, etc., it goes back into Asia. And this is where I think the potential for within Asian intermediation and looking at ways of managing exchange rate risk, perhaps significantly increasing the size of the AIIB, National Development Bank, setting up new institutional structures, etc. I mean, there's a whole wealth of possibilities. And particularly at a time when returns of putting money into, into the US or into London, particularly in fixed income investments, are literally negative, right? I mean, the incentive, what matters at the end of the day is the relative risk and the relative return. And what is very, very clear is the two following things: the relative return of investments of OECD versus Asia has significantly moved towards Asia, and the relative risk again, we've had the Euro crisis, we've had Trump, we've had Brexit. If you look at, G10 currency volatility, it's larger than the currency volatility of many Asian currencies, etc. Right? And from that relative risk, relative return equation, that has dramatically changed over the past couple of years or so, where that combined with demographics and the technological force of solar and other fast developments means that the lie of the land is much more clear. So both for Asian savings to be intermediated within Asia before having to be dollarized or euroized, plus the incentive for our pension funds just to ensure viability. And given we have a 90% OECD home bias for OECD pension funds, and 50% of global GDP and rising already comes from outside the OECD and mostly from Asia. The lie of the land is very clear.
Alicia, you work with a great number of Asian financial institutions. How do you see the prospects for intermediation within Asia? How's that going? Is that going to grow? How's it going to grow? Unmute, please.
Sorry, I was saying that maybe now I can think twice of what I was saying, because I was saying that I was going to spoil the party, but not on the financing necessarily, because China is actually one of the biggest green financing markets for green finance. But it's more about this idea that if everything is so easy, why it hasn't happened yet? Yeah, I mean, that's the one and only thing I have to say to the enthusiasm, which is of course welcome. But I mean, we're so far in Asia, let's face it, even in countries, Japan, I mean, why are we so far in a country like Japan? I mean, literally pushed to a target that looks like China. I mean, they could do so much better. Why are we so far in Asia, even in developed Asia? That would be my first question. And having lived in Asia for many years, I do get that this is changing fast, meaning that people realize that a lot of what's happening is climate related, but it's a new phenomenon, because for a long time, it just seemed not to be. And I think there has been much less demand for change than there has been in Europe. So that's, and even in very developed economies, I give you the example of Hong Kong, where I've lived very long. I mean, literally no recycling, no. So it is something that we need to really reflect upon, because as I said, Asia might be different. And my point when saying that was really that maybe, although I do believe in market mechanisms and I see all of the benefits of that, they are in a way so far behind that they need to do a lot before, meaning subsidies, meaning realizing of where they really are. I mean, and the urgency of the matter. But having said that, on the green finance, I think that's different. I think there we can see, and we are seeing a huge revolution in green finance in Japan. I mean, if you talk to Japanese asset managers, they have big targets on climate, but on other, of course, ESG more generally. So I do think that that's changing in Asia, especially Japan, followed by South Korea, and it's a big thing. So that can accelerate the process beyond what I do agree is a change in mindset. But we are really far behind. I don't want to leave this seminar without saying that out loud. We're really far behind.
Understood. Let me change the discussion a bit. Someone asks, if the Paris Agreement has to be fully implemented, many assets, coal and oil, etc., will be stranded. We'll then not have only stranded assets, but also stranded communities and stranded workers. How can Asia manage this situation? Who would like to come in on that? It's a tough question.
Maybe I'll have a go, but I'm sure others can have a better shot at it, perhaps. Yes, this is one of the points that we were trying to recognize. It's all very well for us to sit in Washington and say, look, a carbon price is the answer. Why hasn't it been done, as Alicia has been saying? Because you have many peoples whose livelihoods and many cities. I mean, having worked in China for many years, there are entire cities that are, largely dependent on coal production or a large power plant. So yes, there are huge communities, a large number of workers, and they'll be significantly affected. So you need a plan. Unfortunately, the plan should not be to keep this stuff going because it's not sustainable. In the UK, we had a lot of people working in coal, but over the period of about 10 years with carbon pricing, we managed to remove it. Didn't do enough about supporting them to find new jobs, perhaps, but there are lessons to be learned. And the answer here is that you need to provide alternatives. And if you do a green investment push at the same time, and you use existing schemes like early retirement or retraining programs and large-scale regional development projects plus green investment, you can produce good results. But we're not going to deny there are going to be some affected people. It's not easy, but you need to start sooner rather than later is the answer.
Other thoughts on this one?
I think I mean, so first of all, I mean, we also must remember what we're talking about, if you just look at the number of coal miners who die in China every year, right? I mean, many of these jobs are not quality jobs. Many of these jobs are sadly, not even very productive jobs, right? I mean, so there is a group of, let's call, potentially stranded countries, which are large fossil fuel exporters, where there's a huge fiscal dependence on, oil and gas exports, et cetera, right? I mean, that's a challenge in itself, and that's a separate discussion, a separate seminar. But for the most part, anywhere from India to Indonesia to China, if you go to a coal mining town and community, I mean, it's not quality of life. It takes 10, 15 years of your life and all the rest of it. So in some sense, right, any job in terms of just the quality of life would be better than what is currently on offer. The second is, right, I mean, at the end of the day, if it is not a viable industry, and that same amount of subsidy that is being used to keep that alive, that same amount of money can be put towards, if nothing else, just work to welfare programs of the kind that India has tried to develop. And the third, I think, and this is again where so abstracting from the present discussion, this is how I see the world. So the world never has had as much capital as it has today, mostly in the OECD, chasing its own tail, so much liquidity, not knowing where to deploy money, throwing money at Google and Apple that are literally sitting on 200 billion of savings in the banks, right? And the world has never had as much spare labor capacity, of which 20, 25 million people coming into the workforce every year in Asia, right? And you put the two together, many of the problems we are discussing, inflation, et cetera, go away, and you are potentially at the cusp of the next golden age of globalization. And then it becomes a challenge of putting capital together with labor and creating those jobs, and the productive boost to those countries as well as the global economy is potentially huge, right? I mean, so we are in a very good place where the demographics in Asia, the capital we have within the OECD, and the enabling technology, including the kind that's allowing us to do this virtually, have all come together to lead to what could potentially be the next golden age of globalization that allows us to reduce poverty and address climate change at the same time.
Swatha.
Actually, I think, this whole idea of it's going to be a big structural change. And I think most people don't want to admit this. So that's why there's this whole idea of we're going to have green growth. We'll continue to grow. It's just going to be green. I don't think so, actually. There's going to be a big change. And some of the ways to deal with it, James has already mentioned. And some of the things that Sonia has been mentioning actually is about capital from Europe moving to Asia, basically. Now, why doesn't it move there, right? I mean, this is a age-old question. Even Lucas had once asked, why doesn't capital flow from the high income countries to low income countries where it should be more productive? So the problem is actually whenever we are thinking, even in the seminar right now, when we are thinking actually a lot is how to deal with climate change. It's all about what governments can do how to involve the private sector, how to actually get them actually to invest, how to get the private investors, private sector to invest in sustainable development. And that's where, having some kind of standards, developing standards for what is green. I mean, like, Europe just recently went through this entire thing of defining what is green after a long time. And I'm not even sure how satisfied everybody was with the definitions of everything. And it's going to be even harder for a region like Asia. But you have to define actually what exactly is green. Once some standards are there, people know what they're investing in. How do we actually develop our green bond markets? Basically, just now ECB did it. ECB just said, we're going to actually accept sustainability linked bonds in our open market operations, and that's it. And once they do it, they have some definition of what is green and what's sustainable, and actually accepting them means you're developing those markets. So the role of, I think, is there's a lot of potential there, which is kind of missing, and just putting everything on the shoulder of the governments is not the way. And I also feel that, everybody doesn't take climate change very seriously. I mean, like, as Alicia was just mentioning, right? People just don't think about it, right? Some people actually, and not in a holistic manner either. And I'll give you one example. Last year when I was writing the report, it was very interesting. My niece who lives in London, she's a chef. And I was telling her what I'm working on, sustainable consumption and production. And she said one thing to me. She said, Masi, I have a hard time believing that. I understand why people turn vegan or vegetarian, it's not good for the environment to eat meat. But then she was talking about how they still want to have an avocado sitting in London coming from halfway across the world, right? Basically. So we don't understand what the carbon footprints of everything we are doing. That's one of the things. And one thing that Asians don't understand is that they want to emulate the West. They want to actually achieve the same standard of living the West has had. And I don't think it's ever going to be possible for all of us in Asia to achieve that standard of living. Because there have been estimates by UNEP and everybody, I mean, like different organizations, that we need about 4 or 5 Earths if we really want to do that. So nobody comes straight out and say hey, you've got to change your mindset. You've got to change the way we are living. We have to change the way we think of future. What is it that we can afford and what we should do? So I think a little bit emphasis on that has to be there too. Everything on the shoulders of the government is not going to get us there. That's for sure. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Swatha. James, you said earlier that this has become a Ministry of Finance problem. And as I listen to this with my Minister of Finance hat on, I hear you asking me to change my carbon pricing, my either subsidies or tax carbon more. I also hear a huge list of social protection programs, infrastructure investment that I have to do. It's an incredible fiscal demand. At the same time, in any developing country, you have education, you have health, you have a whole set of things. As Swatha rightly pointed out, it's part of a whole package. So is the IMF sort of now getting in a position where it can start helping ministers of finance think through all of this, think through the interconnections between raising taxes, between raising expenditures, how it all fits together in a sustainable financial model over time? What's the IMF got on offer so far for these countries?
I think we are getting very close to be able to provide that kind of service to our members. For some time, we've been providing capacity development, analytical work on carbon pricing, the administration of these carbon taxes, which can be complicated. On the budgetary side, there's a lot of work going underway by the IMF, but also with others. And this is the idea of green budgeting. The idea, how do you bring climate into the budget? It's really, budgets happen all the time. We've talked about bringing inequality into your considerations, bringing gender, bringing health. Climate's another one of them. So you just need to have people who understand a bit about how climate works. So when your infrastructure ministry is looking at all the projects they have in mind, they have people who ask the question, well, how resilient is this infrastructure? So when the Ministry of Finance gets the plans from the various ministries, there's people, a group, a unit, some people with some background who can say, well, this doesn't seem to fit with our climate objectives. So it's a matter of building up capacity, just like in the IMF. When Swatha was there and Alicia, etc., climate was maybe 1 or 2 people, a couple of experts hived off in some department. Now a lot of the regular economists are pretty familiar with climate issues. And that's where I think ministries of finance have to get. They need to develop this and become an in-house expertise rather than just something that you hive off. And we together with many other organizations, I'd give a lot of credit here to the World Bank and the OECD and the Asian Development Bank, etc., and to develop these green budgeting standards. Asia is actually a leading area for green budget tagging. So it's very hard to know how much you're spending on climate already. You ask a country, what's your adaptation spending? Most countries don't know, including the most advanced countries. So before you can make plans, you need to know what you're doing already. And just making a taxonomy of what is a climate expenditure, how much of your education spending is climate related. These are the basic building blocks. So I think there's work underway, and we hope to be part of that.
Thanks, James. So we're winding up here. Maybe I could ask each of the panelists to give a 1-minute summary of what they've taken away that's new and different, if you will, from this discussion. Swatha, let me turn to you first because you had the last word in the other way around. What would you say in 1 minute?
I mean, well, I think we all agree that a couple of things actually here, that it's a very complex issue. It's not easy to solve, but we've got to start somewhere, right? And we've got to start building on some kind of capacity, basically. Fund is building, so should Ministry of Finances build as well. But I think there should be a little bit more recognition of the fact that it is a bigger effort. It's not just one government or one person or one business. Everybody has to come in together. We are all in it together, right? Actually, climate change, when things happen, we know we all in it together. So I think that's one thing we need to take away from it, that we need to think it a little bit more in the intersectoral kind of way, basically. And James was mentioning about how these guys, this budgeting and green budgeting and all this. 2 years ago, I just want to mention that New Zealand came out with well-being budget, where, once you need more money, basically, you have to justify basically how are you spending it on the mental health of these youth and blah, 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 right? And that's just an easy way to start off with, right? But as long as you have to just make the priority, you just have to make climate change your priority, and I think the rest will take care of itself. That's it.
So start somewhere. Don't worry about where to start, but start. Sunny, you've been our optimist today. Give us 1 minute of optimism.
Well, think of it this way. Imagine a scenario where, the economics 101 of where Asia needed to go on climate mitigation was not where it is today. Because as of today, from an economics 101 perspective, it makes absolute complete sense, right? Think of it that if we were at a time when there was a huge financial crisis, not enough savings to go around, huge investment needs. Fortunately, we are not in that position. We've got more than enough capital that we know what to do with. Think of it 10 years back, when it was actually very, very expensive to deploy solar, et cetera, right? Fortunately, we're lucky. We've got technology in the right place. So I think, as I said, in most countries, demographics, technology, economics, and finance all are roughly, and the changing zeitgeist awareness, right? I mean, we live in a global public policy debate discussion where whatever happens, when Greta marches, it reaches Indonesian villages, and the awareness is changing. So I think that, the pace at which climate awareness, climate investment, technology, the changing zeitgeist, everything is moving is going to be absolutely, and those of us, who visited Shanghai, 10 years apart, saw the pace of change that can happen. And I think we're just going to be completely overwhelmed. Is everything going to be in the right direction, climate adopted and mitigation? No, absolutely not. But the majority of it is going to be, and of course, the fund and the UNESCO and, all of us have an important role to play there. So I remain optimistic.
Alicia, you said earlier, we haven't seen it yet. So what is it that's going to make us see it now? What's going to start that zeitgeist going that Sunny's talking about? What do you see as
of course, we are seeing targets, China being the most obvious case more recently, that should increase my optimism. I have to say that, and the psyche too. I agree with all of that. But this seminar was also about two things. Yeah, the fiscal side of things. I think we are far in Asia. I want to highlight what Swatha said, because I've seen it with my own eyes. Yes, countries are setting their targets, but they're forgetting about what they are financing elsewhere. So there's a lot of leakage. I want to end with the word leakage. And that means that if you're a small, poor country, you know, at the bottom of the graphs that we saw from James, you're going to see, look at my huge neighbor. I mean, why would I have to do this? Anyway, I'm going to have typhoons or, you know, you name it anyway. So the key here is this is indeed a global problem. It needs a global solution, but we have nations around, and we've learned the hard way with COVID, yeah? But we've not learned it all. And we are still we haven't yet learned it all with something as serious as COVID. So that brings me to the point that we may need to find enforceable mechanisms to make solutions more global. I don't think you can expect a small country in Asia to reconduct its fiscal policy if a bigger one out there is still financing coal plants. So we have to be more realistic as to the incentive structure, if I may say. Yes, the objective is clear, but the incentive structure might not yet be there to solve the problem.
In some sense, let's get the big ones going and the other ones will follow along.
Yeah.
James, I'll give you the last word. And again, before I give you the last word, let me thank you for presenting a very interesting report and starting a very interesting discussion going. I think it's been good today. What do you take away from all of this for the IMF and for your report and for the world, if you will, in 1 minute?
I have a feeling Asia could be getting close to a tipping point. Yes, the starting point is bad, but as we've all heard, the opportunities, and once Asia's moving in the right direction, big things can happen. So I hope we're a couple of years from a big tipping point in Asia. It will be a tipping point for the world.
Great. Thank you very much to all our panelists. It's been an excellent discussion. Thank you to the audience for your attention. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions. There were quite a few, but I hope we got some of them that are interest to you. Go read the report on the IMF website. Look at the climate work that Bruegel's doing, that SCAP's doing, that Sunny's doing, that CGD's doing. I think we're all trying to find solutions for this. And so I think if we keep talking like this, we'll be able to do it slowly but surely. Again, thank you for a great day. Bye.